Hello, everyone. So, today I would like to discuss some strategies that you can use to stop obsessive thinking. For those of you who struggle with OCD or anxiety, you will soon understand that a great deal of suffering comes from the way we think. For most of us, it would also become very apparent that we weren't really taught how to deal with our thoughts. A lot of times we hear people saying, "Don't think about it, just distract yourself." And although distraction can be useful for some cases, most of the times when you try and distract yourself, you're actually increasing the resistance towards those same thoughts. And by increasing the resistance, you are increasing the tendency or the strength of these thoughts to stay in your system. For starters, I think it's useful to question and define what is a thought. And so a thought is often a piece of language or imagery that pops up in our mind, but that in most times it gains a dimension or a weight in our consciousness that it has the power to completely drown us in its sphere. It is also important to understand that thinking is an extremely useful skill, and therefore we cannot just simply live our lives without thinking. That is never the point of this. It's the goal with us training our minds is to use thought as a better tool and aid to navigate our lives. A lot of what we have, a lot of the products of modern society are based on our ability to think. So thinking is, without a doubt, extremely important. The problem is when thinking becomes the norm. And so for people that struggle with OCD and anxiety, you will be very aware that thinking is in fact a problem. But an important aspect of thinking that should be discussed is that everyday life is already a form of neurosis. So even people who don't struggle with OCD and anxiety are still in some way thinking in ways that are completely dysfunctional. One of the reasons for overthinking normally is tied to trauma. So you're thinking because you're trying to distract yourself from a certain experience or emotion. And so your brain just tries to create a lot of distractions in your mind that take the form of rumination as a way to just prevent you from facing your fears. Overthinking is also a form of trying to get control. So you're trying to find different ways to rationalize or figure out a solution. And like I said before, thinking can be a great way to, some problems just need a little bit more thinking. But a lot of times we are just stuck in this rumination, in these endless thought loops that bring no benefit at all. And this is because to some extent, we're trying to run away from some trauma. And so here I would like to briefly discuss what the literature mentions about obsessive thoughts. And I think there are two dimensions that are important here to discuss. One of them is the level of abstraction that these intrusive thoughts have in your mind. So if we're talking about abstract thoughts that are just, you're just ruminating on them, and this is very much the case in existential OCD, then distraction is most likely not going to help you. It's just going to be a short-term fix. And you will soon realize that by trying to distract yourself, you're just building up this resistance, and you're most likely adopting the compulsion of thought suppression. And thought suppression is, kind of a paradoxical nature, because in one hand, your mind is trying to distract yourself by thinking a lot and coming up with these fragments of imagery and language. But on the other hand, your mind is also trying to protect you from those same thoughts by inducing thought suppression. And so we have this dilemma here. And like many things in life, with obsessive thoughts, especially those that are abstract in nature, the best way is to find a way to intentionally face them. And a good way to do this is to write. Really write these thoughts down. Do not focus on the grammar and punctuation of your writing, but just really try to write them down. By writing them down, you are doing kind of a double exposure, because you're becoming more structured in the way that you're thinking about these thoughts, and you're reconciling the thought itself with an action, with a motor action of actually writing it down. And so that double exposure tends to be very helpful. So having a daily practice of just writing down your worries and obsessive thoughts can be pretty good. If you are dealing with intrusive thoughts that are, just not abstract at all, they are just momentaneous appearances in your mind, then distraction can be a good method. And by distraction, I don't really like using the word distraction because I don't think it is the best word to describe in this case. But shifting your attention from the thoughts to something else is a good method. And so in this case, you can, for example, focus yourself on your breathing, on your body, and in the environment around you. So that shift of attention can be pretty helpful if you're just dealing with these lower level abstract thoughts. For those struggling with anxiety and OCD, you will soon realize that there is this disconnect between your thinking and your emotions. So the feeling part of this equation. Because a lot of times you will think when you want to feel and you will feel when you want to think. And so you have this sort of wrong priming of your ability to engage in thinking and emotion. And a lot of times what perpetuates the thinking is an underlying emotion that hasn't been processed. And so in these situations, mindfulness can be pretty helpful. And so you might have a lot of thoughts going through your mind, but really try to see the trail of emotion that is behind a certain thought. And so, for instance, an example of this is I might have a repetitive, intrusive thought about what is the meaning of life. And something you should do in this case is just ask yourself, what does it feel like to have this question? You might feel existential dread, anxiety, sadness, or in some situations, that same question can elicit some form of enthusiasm or curiosity, or even just be a source of excitement. An important aspect here is that you really cannot control your thoughts. And this is something that I don't see as being discussed nearly as much as it should, because you have a lot of people telling that you can control your thoughts, you can shift your thinking from negative to positive, and this, of course, then results sometimes in toxic positivity. And so I think part of the challenge is realizing that you really cannot control your thoughts. Your thoughts pop out of nowhere, they arise, and then they go. But if we are not paying enough attention, it seems as if they are of our own authorship, as if they're just being constantly produced by ourselves. But that is not the case. We really cannot control your thoughts. If I were to ask you a question of the first movie that pops up in your mind, you would tell me the name of the movie. But if you pay close attention to that answer, you will realize that the name of the movie just popped out of nowhere, basically. It just popped up into your consciousness. In my case, it was Titanic. For some reason, it just came up. I don't really know the reason. And so our minds are constantly trying to tell a narrative about what we are perceiving, feeling. This is just part of the human mind. And we need to accept that this is simply what our mind does. And something that it's helpful here is to kind of take a step back and try to observe that as a neutral spectator. And this is where mindfulness and meditation practice come in pretty handy. But these are skills that take time to build up. There's no shortcut here. This is something that you need to gradually train your mind to do, because if you're like the rest of us, your mind is probably very chaotic. I mean, if we were to have a machine typing all of our thoughts and then projecting them onto the world, anyone would think you're crazy, because most of the thoughts that we have are extremely fragmented. They do not really follow logic. A lot of them are cut short, and many of them are just simply extremely repetitive. So what I'm trying to say here is that we want to build flexibility. The idea that we are meditating to stop thinking is simply a wrong target, a wrong goal, and it's not going to work well. The goal of meditation is not to stop thinking, it's to change your relationship to your thoughts. So in first place, you need to recognize that you cannot control your thoughts. They will simply show up and go away whenever they please. And so letting go of that struggle is many times the goal. Additionally, it is also important to realize the emotional trail that that thought is leaving behind, because just an example of this is, if you're feeling anxious, you are likely experiencing fast moving thoughts. The pace of your thinking just changes. But if you just do a breathing exercise for 5 minutes, then you will realize that most likely the pace of those thoughts is going down. And a lot of times, just by doing a breathing practice, you will realize that the same thought that you were seeing as a threat, that you were marking as being of negative valence, just shifts. And so the background of our body, the emotional background, deeply influences how we categorize a certain thought. There are also plenty of studies showing how rumination, daydreaming, how the contents of those thoughts tend to be mostly negative. But at the same time, it is also important to mention that in the literature, there is also evidence about the benefits of daydreaming, of just letting your mind go free. A lot of creativity comes from this place, when you just let your mind flow. A lot of our best ideas just come when we are not trying at all. And so many times it's the trying that makes us go in trouble. It is that same trying that is an effort towards not having to release the control over your mind that allows your mind to control you. That's simply one of the things that goes on. Another aspect of thinking is that when you think too much and you get lost in this world of symbols, is that many of these thoughts are self-referential. And so we have these regions in the brain called the default mode network. There are these regions that are involved in self-referential thinking, and they tend to be more activated, for instance, in depression. That most of the times, the way we think about ourselves is in some way negative. We're criticizing ourselves. We are, we're just in this pattern of negative thinking. But a lot of times, the answer to that is not to try and think something else, because you're going to lose that war. If you just instill that mentality in you of, okay, I'm going to think one positive thought per negative thought, that's going to be your daytime job. You're just going to spend the rest of your life creating a whole lot of internal resistance, fighting a war that you will never win. Another helpful strategy to reduce the amount of obsessive thinking that you're engaging in is to set a worry timer. And so all of this, once again, comes back to the intention part of the deal, because most of the times we are thinking without any intention. But if we just set aside 5 minutes a day, where you just really adopt that mindset of, I'm going to think as much as I can about this topic that I have been obsessing about. And you really put an intention into it. You let go of the resistance and you just really try to think as much as you can. So you kind of build up this paradoxical intention towards it. That can also be very helpful. Another helpful technique comes from the Stoics. The Stoics were just simply brilliant. It's such an interesting philosophy to get into. But there's a technique called negative visualization, where, once again, you intentionally think about an outcome that really scares you. And so you make an intention to think about it deliberately for like 10 seconds. And at the end of those 10 seconds, you stop. And then you just try to build up moments in your day where you just have this intention of thinking about the worst case scenario. And you will soon realize that by doing such an exercise, it's sort of like getting a mental vaccine. You are exposing yourself to a little bit of the virus, but that is going to give you some immunity to these problems that are, just overwhelming you. And so there's also an aspect that I would like to discuss, which is that to reduce your obsessive thinking, it's not just a matter of changing the way you think. It's not a matter of psychoanalyzing your thoughts, about asking why you are thinking any of these thoughts. Because truth be told, the reason for why you're thinking any of these thoughts, it's just going to be another thought. And you're just going to end up in that loop of just questioning why you're thinking about a certain thought, about a certain situation. And so dealing with your obsessive thoughts, it's not just a matter of working your mind. It's also a case of working your body, of dealing with stressors, of dealing with, of being more grounded in your body instead of being just up here in your head. Because a lot of times what thinking does is that it completely reduces your sense of self. You just feel like you're this sensation that is in between the sides of your head, sort of in the middle of your head, and then the whole world is just completely something separate from you, and just everything feels distant, and you're trapped inside this brain in a vat. And so this is why it's important to really be deliberate about scheduling moments in your day where you just try to focus on the environment around you. Try to get engaged in whatever is going on. But like I was mentioning, and this is truly compatible with the idea of embodied cognition, is that if you're able to, for instance, use your body to calm your mind, that is, of course, a strategy that should be used, because sometimes it's far easier to inhabit our body than our minds. And at the same time, our minds and bodies are not separated. The brain is a system, the body is a system that is fully integrated. And so we need to look at this from a holistic perspective, where we include all of these interdependent parts together. And so taking care of your body, exercising, and there are various different modalities of exercise. You can do strength training, you can do endurance training, you can even just walk. So just doing activities that will make your body healthier will most likely also improve your mental well-being. And my last advice, and this is something that for most of us is hard to do, but is something that I believe that truly fuels this obsessive mind, is try to reduce the amount of short bursts, highly rewarding, very low cost activities. So for instance, watching a lot of shorts on YouTube, watching one after the other, or watching a lot of reels on Instagram, or just using TikTok and spending a lot of time there. I think a big problem with this is that you're training your mind to just inhabit this, kind of weird twilight zone where there is a dispersed focus, no attention, and where your mind is just continuously running, and is never fixed on a certain place. And so I truly believe that trying to expose yourself to longer content, or just really try to go out more in nature and reduce the amount of these short type content. Just avoid watching that as much. And that will absolutely help also with training your mind to just not be running all the time. Because a lot of times we just watch these reels, these shorts, because we are trying to run away from a certain emotion or a certain thought. We are trying to once again pollute our minds with, extremely relevant and, noisy content. And so that is also very helpful. And of course, nutrition. There are a lot of nutrition is extremely important in navigating our mental health. So, for instance, reducing the amount of refined sugars that you eat and processed foods, that will also help you with obsessive thinking. And so my main message here is that for starters, you cannot control your thoughts, nor should you expect to. The goal is just to simply change your relationship with thinking, and that changing the way you think, or changing the way you relate with your thinking, is not just a matter of using mental strategies, but there is a whole lot of embodied strategies that you can use that I have mentioned in this video. So hopefully this was helpful.